OmniaBalance.life brings you the effects of phone radiation on human blood, an analysis of live blood before and after using a mobile phone for 20 minutes. What we will see today, we observe the results of live blood analysis on 3 blood samples. Firstly, we have the baseline sample taken after no exposure to a phone. Secondly, we have an unprotected sample taken after 20 minutes of watching a video streamed via Wi-Fi on a phone. And thirdly, we have what we call a balanced sample, where we apply the Omnia Radiation Balancer patch to the phone and we see what effects we can observe. Blood samples. So one of these blood samples is what you might call healthy, but we will look at samples like these and analyse why changes happen and see what this means. We will see if this gives us any conclusions based on the samples that we've taken. We must issue a disclaimer at this point. The observations in this video are indicative only, and we appreciate that live blood analysis is open to interpretation and debate. This is not put forward as a definitive scientific study. The observations are personal and yours will be different, and in fact sometimes one person's results will be different from 1 hour to the next because our body is always changing. Please get your own analysis to see what your personal results are. And always consult a qualified health professional if you have concerns about how microwave radiation is affecting your health. The Omnia Radiation Balancer is not a healing device. It is a patch which restores balance to any radiation field so that it no longer is in dissonance with the human body. And lastly, to deal with radiation of any kind, the best solution is to reduce your exposure. And that said, the observations in this video are real. Hi, I'm here with Gareth Edwards, who runs Food for Life in South London. And what we're going to do today is we're going to observe my blood before and after the use of a mobile phone for 20 minutes. And we're going to look at the changes that we can observe. So Gareth, thanks for joining us. First of all, what is live blood analysis and what can it tell us?
With live blood analysis, Tim, you're seeing what is. We see how red blood cells are interacting. We see what red blood cells look like, literally as they are. We see pictures which we can record as video or still images of red blood cells on a slide. There's no alteration, there's no staining, there's no change in that blood. It is literally a drop of blood which comes from somebody, which we put on a slide and observe in phase contrast view and see what is there. So it allows us to see how red blood cells are interacting with each other, whether they're sticking together or not, and the state of the plasma, which is the fluid that surrounds red blood cells.
Great. And you can look at the behaviour and the movement and
the shape and the size.
And the shape and the size, which
yes.
is important. Great. So rather than, like, say for example, if I was going to a hospital or a clinic, and I might take a blood sample and then it comes back with lots of measurements and that sort of thing. This is different because you can actually see it, right?
Yeah, it's a qualitative assessment. We're observing quality and interaction rather than that type of assessment, which is numerical. It's quantitative.
Right.
And in those assessments, the blood is stained and altered. So they're both valid observations, but we get a different perspective, which in my clinical practice I've found really helpful, useful for helping people be motivated to make change. Because there's something quite absorbing about observing your blood, and it will move because it is live blood.
Great, and we're going to use this microscope which relays to this computer, which gives us a video output, or we could take stills or whatever. Great, so now we're going to get on and do the samples. There's no need to show you the blood samples being taken, but once they are, Gareth has a look at them using his microscope and then records the results on his computer. So Gareth is just having a look at sample 1, which is the baseline, which is where I had no exposure to any mobile phone for at least half an hour. And now I'm going to watch a video for 20 minutes. And after that we're going to do sample 2 and observe what we see in the blood then. So here goes.
To make an amendment, which if they were successful, would have led to...
Now we're going to do a test on a mobile phone where we apply the Omnia Radiation Balancer. So what we do is we take one of the stickers in different colours here and we peel it off, and all we do is we put it on the back of the phone. You can also put it on your SIM card, which is an even better way of balancing the radiation. So you can see that it's on the back there. What we're going to do now is just watch another video for 20 minutes and then take another sample, and eventually what we'll do is we'll contrast sample 1, the baseline, with sample 2, the unprotected sample, with sample 3, which is the one we're doing now. So I'm just going to watch another video for 20 minutes and we'll see what the difference is.
How much annoyance it's causing people to be hearing nothing but Brexit across the media, as important as it is.
So one thing that I'm noticing while I'm watching this video with the Omnia Radiation Balancer on is that it's just less hot as I'm watching the video. So as the video is streaming beforehand, it was hot, and now I'm not feeling that heat. So there might be nothing in that. It might be just, you know, it just might be coincidental, but it's an observation anyway.
When I use live blood analysis in my clinical work, there are lots of things that I'm looking at with the red blood cells that we see in the view. Here, we're just identifying one specific element of what we're observing, which is the interaction of the cells, the adhesion and the coherence. In the clinical work, I might be looking at the size, the shape, whether there are white centres in the red blood cells. But here, we're just looking at, are the red blood cells adhered to each other? And in addition to that, I form a view based on an overall observation by moving around the sample. So let's just review that in the samples that we look at. As we move around the baseline sample, we can start to get an impression of the interaction of the red blood cells. There's an area there where they're stuck together, but generally what we're looking for is an overall impression from the sample as we move around it. And we can see that there are large areas where the red blood cells are separate from each other. There are individual areas where there may be some adhesion, but that may be around an air bubble or towards the edge of the slide. So generally, we can sense here that there are fairly substantial tracts and areas where the red blood cells sit separately from each other. They're residing in their own space. There are certainly areas where they adhere, but the general impression as we scroll through is one where some of Tim's red blood cells sit in their own space, separate from each other. There are certainly areas where some stick together, but the majority of the areas that we look at, like this, show the red blood cells in their own space, with the plasma around them. So as we now start to look at some of the still pictures from that baseline sample, you can see here that some areas show rouleau and sticking together of the red blood cells, but a great deal of them show the red blood cells separate from each other. And these are some of the areas that I focused on during that observation. You can see the red blood cells residing separate from each other in that baseline sample. When we moved the camera around the sample after Tim had been using the phone without the sticker on, straight away we see that the red blood cells are much more adherent. They're sticking to each other much more. What we might refer to as rouleau is present. We can see that wherever we go in the sample, there simply isn't a visibility of red blood cells residing in their own space. They're much more chained and sticking to each other. So we're moving on to another observation here of this same sample. And again, I mean, we see the odd patch where there may be some separation, but generally speaking, everywhere we go, we see adherent red blood cells sticking to each other. There is the odd patch where there is some separation, but in percentage terms, the picture is much, much more adhered. The red blood cells are much more coherent. And then as we go into the still pictures from that same sample, again, we see substantial areas where the red blood cells are all quite stuck to each other. When the red blood cells are stuck together like this, movement through the capillaries is likely to be compromised. The tasks of delivery of oxygen to the cells of the body and the elimination of carbon dioxide is likely to be compromised. So this is not an ideal scenario when the red blood cells are adherent, as we see here in these pictures from sample 2. There are, of course, some areas where they're not as adhered, but as we said before, we're looking at the overall picture and the general percentage perception. Now, when we move on to the sample taken after the shield had been applied to the phone, again we move around the sample and we're back to seeing a situation where, although there is some adherence, the general picture is one of red blood cells residing much more in their own space. We move around the sample so that we can get a sense of the overall picture, and yes, there are rouleaued areas. This is a human being's blood, and there are other factors other than the phone that affect that situation. So some of the red blood cells here are adhered, but unlike in the previous sample, we can see large tracts and large areas where they're not. They actually sit in their own space. Blood samples do vary, and certainly as you get towards the edge of the slide, the air can affect the view that we see of the red blood cells as well. So in observing that sample, I'm conscious of focusing on areas in the middle of the slide. But when we look at some of the stills, yes, again, we can see some of the red blood cells adhering to each other, but there are tracts and areas again where they're not, where the red blood cells have their own space, much, much more than in the second sample, which we can see here and here. These are stills from the video that we took of the third sample after the sticker had been applied to the phone, and we can see that there are tracts and areas where the red blood cells sit in their own space, which is a much more desirable scenario for health, balance and well-being.
So now we're going to summarise what we've seen, what we've observed, and the differences between sample 1, 2 and 3. So Gareth, tell us, your summaries about, what we saw.
So my view as I've said in the commentaries, there were observable differences there, Tim. I'm slightly surprised when I see this, but I can't, deny what I see. So the first one, there was a degree of cohesion of your red blood cells. Some of your red blood cells were sticking together, some were misshapen. Your blood is what it is. The second observation, which we did after you'd been using the phone, there was definitely more cohesion, more coherence. The red blood cells were sticking together more, which in live blood analysis, we don't think that's a great thing. Those red blood cells need to pass through capillaries. Sticking together is not an ideal scenario. Then in the third observation, which was following you using the phone with the patch stuck to it, there did seem to be some relief. The red blood cells seemed to be less adherent, less sticking together. So that's what I saw.
And tell us a bit more about when blood cells stick together. What's that called?
Well, it's affected by charge. What makes red blood cells reside apart from each other, what is perceived to be the reasoning for that, is something that's called zeta potential. It's a negative charge around cells. So if you imagine the plus and the plus and the minus of a magnet being pushed together, you wouldn't physically be able to do that. And so cell membranes, animal cell membranes, have what is called a zeta potential. They have a negative charge around them, and that means that the cells sit separately from each other when observed normally. If there is a positive charge, a proton charge, a different charge present, then instead of residing in their own space, they can tend to adhere, they can tend to come together.
Right. And we saw a little bit of that in sample 2. From my research, I've heard that that's sometimes called Rouleau syndrome. Is that correct?
Sticking together of red blood cells is called Rouleau.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And is there any official link between that and any health defects or anything like that?
Official. I would say that Rouleau in any form of blood analysis is not perceived to be a desirable state of affairs. Within naturopathic circles and maybe conventional view, the sticking together of red blood cells would not be seen to be a desirable state of affairs.
Right. Okay, great. And we talked about sample 3 as well, and that sample was taken immediately after we had sample 2, and there was a difference. And for me, seeing my own blood on screen, I feel a bit more confident when I see that those cells are actually a nice circular shape for a start, and then secondly, apart from each other, as you mentioned. But just to conclude on that one, it did seem that had restored itself to its natural state. Would you agree on the whole that was a valid?
From what I saw, I mean, I'll be honest with you, Tim, I'm sort of almost ready to not see any change when we look at these things.
Yeah.
And, to an extent, as I said in the commentary when I was looking at the red blood cells, you are moving around in different areas, and so you could argue that there's an element of subjectivity about what you're selecting, but from my experience of looking at these things, the overall picture was noticeably different. That without the shield, there seemed to be an adherence and a cohesion. Yes, that is correct. And then with the shield, it seemed that, as you say, there was some restoration, that there was less adherence. It did seem, from my observations, that was the case.
Okay. So we must stress at this point that this is just one single test. It's a single test on one single person. So I'm going to be different to Gareth if he were to do the same observation, and so on. So this is really just indicative. We've said all along that this is anecdotal. It's just an interesting study. But I'd just like to thank you for all your observations and all your assessment that has been really helpful to just have a look at what is possible and what potentially can happen when you use a mobile phone, but also to have a look at what the Omnia Radiation Balancer can potentially do for people in terms of the observation of the blood. So what are the conclusions that we can make? What did we learn from the live blood analysis procedure? We jump straight into the observation results. So from sample type 1, we had the baseline, where there was no radiation exposure for an hour beforehand. And we had a normal level of adherence, or Rouleau syndrome, about 15%. And adherence is when the blood is sort of sticking together, which is kind of normal, except when it's rampant. We had about 85% of balanced blood in that sample, and it was mostly well balanced. It showed normal signs of adherence. And then looking at the second sample, which was the unprotected phone, that jumped straight up to 80% of adherence. There was hardly any balanced blood in that sample. That was after 20 minutes of watching a video, and the majority of the sample showed severe adherence and Rouleau syndrome. And then straight after that, and we must stress that we actually took the third sample at the time when the body was already experiencing that Rouleau syndrome from the second test. And what we noticed is that the balance returned. The balanced blood was up to about 75%. Sure, there was some remnants of the adherence and the Rouleau of about 25%. But remember, if the baseline is anything to go by, there's about 15% of Rouleau in any given time anyway, or at least today, the day of the test. So Rouleau was significantly and quickly reversed, and the majority of the blood was showing good balance, good space, and good shape. So the takeaways we would say are these results are personal. The results are not officially recognised, but they are real. It's important to state that what we're looking at is real. People always want to see a clinical test, something that's approved, etc. And we get that. But it was important for me to test the product that I am marketing. And I know that the technology in the Omnia Radiation Balancer works as it is intended. We support any independent clinical test, any double-blind, peer-reviewed official study performed to the highest level of trust and control that seeks to confirm or deny our findings. We're all in favour of that. And this would help everyone. And it's very easy to achieve for any governments or health bodies out there that wish to take that on. So finally, the takeaways are the results of our one-off indicative test showed us the immediate impact of radiation on the blood and the significance of exposure even in small doses. Secondly, the visibility of the capability of the Omnia Radiation Balancer to start to restore balance back to the blood after just 20 minutes of being applied to the phone. So we urge you to take this issue seriously, and because this video has a purpose, we urge you to take action by visiting our website, where you can find out all of the information about the clinical studies that show the biological effects that back up what we've seen in this video. So find us at www.omniabalance.life. Thank you.